Hey you dirty birds, welcome to the most awkward book signing ever.
Is this seat taken?
Of course it is, mister.
Now that we finished another hefty scoop of Castle Rock, it's time to take a deep dive into Season 2's ending. Unlike Season 1, which left us with a pretty ambiguous end, Annie's journey isn't as open-ended, yet still leaves us with many unanswered questions. You'll want to stick around for the whole video, as I'll be going over if Joy was actually possessed by Amity, what happened to Annie, and how the kid ties Season 1 and 2 together. So grab some ice cream because here we go. Episode 10 begins right where we left off in Episode 9. Pop's body is taken away to undergo the weaving process after Ace shot him in the head. Pop will later be imbued with the spirit of a French settler named Etienne. Remember that these spirits can access the memories of their vessels, which is exactly what Ace wants from Pop. Pop has information about the Angel, information which was previously held in these letters between Alan Pangborn and Dale Lacey. But since Pop burned the letters, the info now exists only in his memory.
Only in my memory.
Back at the Marston home, the townspeople, including Joy, are still hypnotized by the statue of the kid. Now here's unanswered question number 1. How come some of the citizens can hear the sound that hypnotizes them while others can't? In episode 9, Amity asks this question, but no one seems to know.
Why didn't we hear the sound? Why aren't we hypnotized?
One theory is that those unaffected are on antipsychotics, since we know drugs seem to have a dampening effect on the spirit's powers. This still wouldn't explain characters like Chance or Nadia, who, to my knowledge, aren't on anything at all. The second theory is that those who do not hear the voice are considered unclean, or not worthy of being in Amity's army, an army which Ace says will soon take over the world upon Amity's return. I think this is the more credible theory, especially since Ace calls the noise the voice of the angel, and that it and the sound of the schisma, which we heard more about in Season 1, are one and the same. Pop is put into that goo where we'll later see that his bullet wound has been healed, which also likely means that his cancer has been cured as well. But this was all part of Pop's plan. Last episode we watched him inject Haldol into his body to stave off the weaving process. He then has to put some acting chops on in front of Ace, gaining his trust so that when he's assigned to track down and kill Nadia and Amity, he can save and help them in their quest to blow up both the Marston home and crypts beneath the construction site. It's here we learn a little more about the Angel, aka the Kid, and the Schisma. Ace refers to Castle Lake as a door to other heres, nows, and dimensions. I'll get more into this and the Kid later on in the video. Pop's sacrifice, when he later frees Chance and chains himself to the wall to die with the Marston home, is the end of his redemptive arc. He's lived most of his life with the secret that he killed Nadia and Abdi's mother while on a mission in Somalia, adopting them out of guilt for what he had done. In Nadia's eyes, he's irredeemable.
If I live through this night, I'm gonna leave this place. And I'm never gonna think of you again.
But judging by her reaction when she has to say goodbye to Pop, I like to think that he was in some way redeemed. Joy is prepared for the ceremony. Notice how they've dyed her hair black. Remember this point for later on. The dagger, which Amity used to kill all the villagers in 1619, is also placed in front of her tomb. The ceremony, as Ace tells the followers, will be the end for Castle Rock, but the beginning for them. Annie tells Nadia and Abdi that if they can destroy that statue, maybe it'll get the townspeople to snap out of their trance. So what better way to do that than a shit ton of explosives? But Annie couldn't care less about the townspeople. All she cares about is Joy, something that will become evident when she tells Ace their plan in order to save her. Nadia and Abdi manage to plant the explosives with the final bomb going to Pop in the Marston home. Joy is brought out to Amity's tomb while the Kid emerges on the cliff by Castle Lake, seemingly to take in the events that are about to transpire. Nadia blows the explosives, killing Pop and lifting the townspeople from their hypnosis. This is the last we see of Nadia, Abdi, Chance, and Ace. I had hoped for a little more closure, especially for Nadia and Abdi. Like, even if Nadia said something to Pop like, "I love you," it would still leave it ambiguous whether or not she ends up forgiving him, which is really what their story is about.
If anyone can bring me back to life, it's you.
We also don't really know what happens to all the French settlers. I doubt all of them died in the explosion, so Castle Rock may have some 400-year-old French spirits walking around. Now, the story picks up 1 week later with Joy and Annie leaving Castle Rock, and instead of a recap of the final portion, I'm going to go right into whether Joy is Amity or not, since it will cover most of the plot points in the final half of the episode. First off, this question is purposely left ambiguous by the writers. However, unlike last season's ambiguous ending as to whether the kid was actually evil or not, there are way more clues and evidence to support a definitive answer. That being that Joy actually was controlled by Amity. Now, what I'm going to do is lay out all the evidence on both sides of the argument and leave it up to you to decide. However, I know which one I'll be picking. To start things off, we know that Amity is supposed to inhabit Joy's body at dusk. We see dusk occur as the sun falls into the horizon over the Marston home. We don't know, however, if more of this ceremony needed to take place or what the exact definition of dusk is. Now, perhaps the most damning evidence against Joy being Amity is that she ends up stabbing Ace. Is it that she didn't know he was actually Augustin? Was she confused? Did the kid tell her to do it, as it was part of a bigger plan? We simply do not know. We then get Annie rushing towards Joy, embracing her, but Joy does not return the hug or even really look like she knows Annie. Now, it's possible she's still traumatized or still getting over this hypnosis, but contrast this to episode 8 when Annie saves her from the Marston attic, and she's 100% returning the hug and ecstatic to see her mother. Let's also talk about that black hair, the same color as Amity's. Later on in the episode, Annie says they can go get some hair dye to change it back, but she says no. Why would Joy not want to change her hair back after it was dyed by a cult is beyond me. From here until the end of the episode, Joy is increasingly distant from Annie, always turning her back on her and getting away at every chance she can get. Of course, that could also just be because of their past and that she's still not over what Annie has done to her. At a gas station, Annie witnesses Joy seemingly flirting with a boy, but it's been hinted at several times in the season that Joy has a thing for girls, specifically Chance. However, that is never really expanded on. This ties into when Annie catches Joy watching a lesbian film called Blue is the Warmest Color. Now, is she watching it because she likes that sexual component of it, or is it because it's in French? This ambiguity is brilliant on the part of the writers. Let's also take into account that Joy tells her mother she'd rather live in Montreal, perhaps because there are more French-speaking people there, even though Montreal is a big mix of French and English. But back to the gas station, because we have to point out that Henry Deaver poster in the background, which basically confirms that this season takes place in an alternate dimension. You'll notice here that the missing poster says Henry was last seen July 7th, 2019. Let's go back to the final episode of season 1. We know the events of that show take place in 2018, and the final few scenes of the last episode, including a Christmas scene with Henry and his son, take place a year later, aka 2019. How could Henry be missing in July 2019 while also spending Christmas with his son and taking care of the kid in 2019? The alternate dimension theory would also explain why, when Ace went looking for the kid at Shawshank, he was nowhere to be found. Back to the question of Joy and Amity. Annie takes a job as a caretaker for someone who is bedbound, a fun nod to how she'll later care for Paul Sheldon, the author of the Misery novels. Annie reads a very curious passage from the novel. Listen carefully as she talks about how the character Gregory came back a different man, and her emphasis on his eyes.
Gregory had come back from the Crimea a different man. It was his eyes. They didn't look out at misery anymore. They looked in, at something only he could see.
Eyes are what Annie finds scrawled over and over again in Joy's drawing book. Eyes that look like they could be the kid's or Ace's. We also know Amity loved to draw. Inside her notebook are some creepy lines like, "He who winks his eye is plotting," and "I will lead you where you do not want to go." They are both Bible verses. Since when was Joy a big Bible thumper, or say knowledgeable about the descendants of God, Adam and Eve? Even Annie's employee says of Joy when she's walking away from Annie,
"The hormones hit. It's like a stranger's living in your house, hey?
Is a stranger, Amity, inside Joy? Annie later overhears a telephone call between Joy and a mystery caller. Now, the letter Annie later finds says it was a lawyer she was talking to in the hopes of being emancipated. But Joy isn't Annie's daughter. Remember, they're sisters, so why would she need to be emancipated? Now, I've listened to the voice on the other end. It doesn't sound like Ace, but it's possible it could be him since we don't see him die, or perhaps Henry Deaver, which I think may be more of a stretch. We simply don't know. That also brings up the question of the letter. If Joy is actually Amity, is it possible the letter was a complete fabrication in order to keep Annie away? Perhaps the biggest evidence to support Joy not being controlled by Amity is Annie's hallucinations. Since we're seeing this all from her perspective and we know she's prone to hallucinations, it's hard to gather what we're seeing as true or not. We know that she is still haunted by the whispers of her mother after the events of Castle Rock. The irony of this ending is that Annie kills Joy by drowning, just like Annie's mother Chrysilda tried to kill her. Drowning's a motif throughout the season. Young Annie almost killed baby Joy via drowning way back in episode 5. Annie ends up giving Haldol to Joy, but we never see it take effect. Perhaps because it takes time to metabolize when it's ingested rather than injected. It's also ironic that Annie is stabbed with a pen, a writing tool. After Annie discovers this letter, she goes back to resuscitate Joy, which works and they live happily ever after. Well, not quite. It's safe to assume everything after Joy's drowning is a mix of reality and fantasy. Joy hugs her mother and tells her she saved her. Joy has finally found her laughing place, and they enjoy ice cream and Joy isn't interested in the other kids. This is what Annie wants in her mind. It's her laughing place, and it's only when we see her father and mother in the Paul Sheldon reading that we see Joy too is a figment of her imagination, Annie living in blissful ignorance of the horrors she's committed. In some ways, misery is the perfect allegory for Annie's life. The only thing that brought Annie joy was joy, a joy she ended up destroying. Her life, therefore, became misery. But how does this connect with the events of Misery the film? And how does she eventually get to Colorado? Well, first you'd have to take into account whether these two stories take place within the same dimension. If they are, it's safe to assume she would continue living on the run, in her mind, with her imaginary Joy, later settling on a remote Colorado ranch where she'll eventually save Paul Sheldon. Then there's the question of the kid, who we now know can traverse these different dimensions using Castle Lake as a portal. I personally believe he's an evil entity that can influence the events around the areas he controls, aka Castle Rock. He's always wanting to expand this influence. After he realizes his plan with Amity was foiled, he simply disappears back into a new time and place, kind of like how young Henry Deaver and Molly Strand were able to do in season 1. It looks like the kid will be the through line for all the seasons, so expect his real identity to be kept secret. However, many think he could be Randall Flagg or the Crimson King, the latter being an immortal being which could explain why he never ages. I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up next season. Now we also can't forget Jackie Torrance. We saw her at the end of season 1 on her way to Colorado to work on a story about the Overlook Hotel. I thought for sure she'd tie into Annie's story since Annie also ends up in Colorado, but if they're in different dimensions, that may not be the case. I really enjoyed this season of Castle Rock, but now I open it up to you. I want to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments below. What did you think of the ending? Please take a moment and give the video a like. Every little bit helps, and I hope to see you all next season. Until next time, remember, Daddy loves you very much.